The Whispering House. Marie had always heard whispers about the old Willoughby house. It stood at the edge of her small town, shrouded in dense fog and surrounded by tall wild grass. The other children claimed it was haunted by a restless ghost, but Marie wasn't afraid. Instead, her curiosity tugged at her whenever she passed by, wondering who or what might be waiting within its worn walls. One crisp autumn afternoon, with a chill in the air, Marie decided to finally explore the mystery for herself. As she approached the creaking gate, the wind whispered through the branches of a nearby willow tree. Her heart beat a little faster, but her resolve remained steady. She slipped through the gate, avoiding its rusted hinges, and made her way toward the front door. The old house seemed to breathe around her. The boards groaned beneath her feet as if the house were alive, and the windows, grimy and cracked, stared back at her with an unsettling gaze. But Marie wasn't one to back away. She took a deep breath, pushed open the door, and stepped inside. The air felt heavy, and there was a chill despite the warmth of the day. She held her breath, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the dusty windows. Cobwebs hung like old lace in the corners, and the smell of age and disuse filled her nose. Marie ventured further, her footsteps echoing through the empty hall. A staircase led up to the second floor, and she hesitated. It was then she heard it, a faint, almost sorrowful voice calling her name. She froze, her eyes wide. She glanced around but saw no one. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and yet it felt sad, lonely.
"Who's there?"
she whispered. But the voice didn't answer. Instead, it seemed to pull her forward, urging her up the staircase. Maria followed the call, feeling both anxious and compelled. She climbed the creaking steps and entered a small bedroom at the end of the hall. The room was cold, and a cracked window let in the chilling breeze. There, standing by the window, was a shadowy figure of a little girl no older than Marie. She wore an old-fashioned dress and had long dark hair that flowed down her back. Marie's breath caught in her throat, and she was rooted at the spot. The girl turned to face her, her eyes empty but full of sorrow. Suddenly, Marie felt the air around her shift. A rush of cold surrounded her, and before she could cry out, her vision blurred. She felt as though she were falling, not down but backward in time. When her sight cleared, Marie found herself in the same bedroom, but it was no longer abandoned. The walls were freshly painted, the furniture looked new, and the window was no longer broken. She glanced at her hands. They weren't her own. She looked down at herself and saw that she was wearing the same old-fashioned dress as the ghostly girl. She wasn't Marie any longer. She was the ghost, and she knew her name, Elsie. Elsie's memories poured into her mind like water into a jar. She felt the heartache of being left behind by her family, abandoned in the house with the promise that they'd return. But they never did. Days turned into weeks, and as the food dwindled, so did her hope. The once cozy home became a prison of loneliness and hunger. The nights grew colder, and Elsie was so small, so fragile. One night, curled up by the window, she could no longer fight the cold or the hunger, and she slipped into a deep, final sleep. Marie could feel the weight of Elsie's sadness, the despair of waiting and the fear of being forgotten pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. Tears welled in her eyes, and she understood now why the ghost had called her here, why it had called to anyone who passed by. It didn't want to haunt the living. It just wanted to be remembered, to not be alone. Suddenly, Marie felt the room grow cold again. The presence lifted, and she was herself once more. She stumbled backward, taking a deep breath as if she had been underwater for too long. The room returned to its abandoned state, the walls faded and peeling.
Elsie?
She whispered, but the ghost didn't appear. Only the soft rustling of leaves outside answered her call. Marie left the house, glancing back one last time before stepping through the gate. The wind seemed to murmur a faint as she walked away. From that day on, Marie didn't tell anyone about her visit to the old Willoughby house. She wasn't sure if they would believe her anyway. But every time she passed by, she felt a small bouquet of wildflowers by the gate, hoping that Elsie would find some comfort knowing she wasn't forgotten. And if you ever pass by the old house, listen closely. You might hear a soft, grateful whisper on the wind.